The Devil May Cry reboot was really weird. It took a franchise that had an already established tone and style and decided to morph it into something completely different in an attempt to garner a more broad appeal. This was done to mixed results, to say the least. Hardcore fans of the original games, like myself, took issue with the way the series' lore and characters were handled. The overall mean-spirited nature, excessive swearing, and unsubtle political messaging helped contribute into making this project feel like anything but Devil May Cry. I love it when stories try to tackle real-world issues, but DMC isn't really the type of series that allows room for that without making drastic changes to that source. On the bright side, though, the gameplay was decently fun in its own right, thanks to the unique mechanics exclusive to... Wait, hold on. Sorry, I put in the wrong footage by accident. Let me just try that again. The Devil May Cry reboot was really weird. So, that new Devil May Cry anime came out recently, and I decided to give it a watch through, and yeah, I wasn't the biggest fan of it. In its attempts at modernizing the franchise, I feel like it did more to alienate fans of the games than anything. It starts off promising, but then slowly gets worse and worse as it goes along. I like the art style and some of the music choices, but aside from that, this show certainly isn't for me. However, during my watch through this, I couldn't help but notice a lot of similarities between this anime and the attempted Devil May Cry reboot that came out only a decade prior. Like, these two pieces of Devil May Cry content are eerily similar in a lot of ways when you really compare the two, and lo and behold, they're getting the same reactions. Liked by critics, hated by fans. Funny that this happened twice. Can't wait to see what the next reboot will look like 10 years from now. Maybe this time they'll actually have Dante running his own business. Crazy, right? DMC Devil May Cry is a very weird game. It's emblematic of the position Capcom was in at the time, and serves as a good reminder of how much they've changed over the years. I don't think I've seen a game studio get dragged through the mud as much as Capcom did in the early 2010s. Before all those fancy Resident Evil remakes and Monster Hunter's explosion in popularity, Capcom was mostly known for doing the world's biggest generation fumble, spamming fighting game re-releases, bad DLC, and most importantly, just releasing a lot of not very good games. You know you messed up when Angry Joe has to give one of his iconic angry rants.
Let's see, what other character could have gone in here? Mega Man!
Yeah, so Capcom wasn't exactly in the best position at the time. You can point fingers at certain individuals as to why this happened, but regardless, Capcom did manage to turn around in the end. Though, if I were to pick one title from their catalog back then that I believe fully represents everything wrong with this era for the company, then it would have to be the Devil May Cry reboot. There was this strange trend at the time where Japanese game developers tried really hard to appeal to Western players. In the case of Capcom, they decided that Devil May Cry needed to be full-on rebooted if they wanted to capture that market. I'm still a bit baffled by this decision. Devil May Cry was never the most story-rich thing in the world. Sure, it had a lot of lore and characters to sink yourself into, but for the average player, that stuff is mostly a backdrop to service the core gameplay. My only assumption was that the reboot angle was chosen so that the style of the franchise could be reimagined. Though I struggle to think of many people who took issue with Devil May Cry's more anime aesthetics it was rocking at the time, but I don't think anyone was expecting a potential reboot to look like this. God, I remember when this trailer came out and everyone lost their minds. Everything looked so different. The tone, the music, the gritty colors, and most importantly, the new design for the main character. You know how Dante has, like, one of the most recognizable character designs ever? Yeah, well, imagine that, but the exact opposite. Safe to say that when you take something as universally beloved as Devil May Cry and decide to make so many major changes to it at once, people won't be happy. DMC Devil May Cry wasn't exactly leading with its best foot forward, and the further the game went along with development, the more bleak the outcome was looking. Whether that be because of games journalists attacking fans for not liking the change, the reveal that the game was only going to run at 30 frames per second, or how Ninja Theory's attitude towards the old games came off as disrespectful, and that Devil May Cry was something that needed to be fixed. I get that the game before this, Devil May Cry 4, wasn't perfect, but a lot of the issues that game faced was a lack of development time. What fans really wanted to see was a game that took the great parts of DMC 4 and refined them, but this remake looked to be anything but that. What this resulted in was a game that did well with critics, but was mixed as hell by fans, with the more vocal side not shying away from voicing that disappointment. Now, what did your old pal Mr. Compendium think? Well, I didn't, because I didn't play this one when it came out. This was before I became a mega fan of the series, so to me, it looked nothing more than a vain attempt at getting teenagers like myself into playing these games. I did try the demo and liked it enough, but I never took the full plunge. I did pick up the game a few years after it came out, but by that point, I was already well familiar with the classics, so I couldn't give a 100% unbiased look at the game. Regardless of that, I honestly didn't think that the game was really all that bad. Flawed for sure, but I think that there's more good to this game than bad, at least in regards to the combat. I don't know, it's been a while since I've played this one. Since the Netflix show is bringing more eyes to the series, I figured that now would be an appropriate time to look back at this one, not just to talk about the game's failings, but to highlight some of the legitimately good stuff buried in here. New fans are going to be picking up these games because of that new anime, and I wouldn't be surprised if some players are wondering if this one is worth their time. Also, I need to get this one out of the way so I can talk about DMC5 with a clear conscience. One thing to keep in mind if you do plan on picking this one up is that there are two distinct versions. There's the vanilla release from 2013, and then there's the definitive version. If you're playing on consoles, then every modern release of DMC is this enhanced version, and it's undoubtedly the superior way to play the game. It removes a lot of the crap that plagued the original one, and adds in some fan favorite features like turbo mode and a manual lock-on button. Big ask, I'm aware. However, if you're like me and play most of your games on your computer, then unfortunately, you're gonna be stuck with the vanilla release. While I do own both, most of this video is going to be based on the original version. I'll talk about the enhancements when they're relevant, fucking hold your horses. I feel as though it's important to talk about vanilla releases of games so we can have a better understanding of what exactly changed over the years. It serves as a good reference point to help understand why a lot of fans took issues with this game back in the day. If you only play the updated version where those issues are addressed, I feel as though there's a bit of a disconnect. Don't underestimate the power of hindsight, because most developers would kill to get an extra 6 months on their projects. Our story begins with a premise that sounds mighty familiar. Long ago, there was an ancient demon king named Sparta. He resided deep in the underworld, and was the right-hand man of Mundus, an especially powerful demon that managed to rise the ranks and eventually gained control over basically every other demon. Anyways, at some point or another, Sparta met this angel named Eva, and eventually formed a lifelong relationship with her. After a lovely Saturday night together, Dante and Vergil were born, but there was a slight catch. When a demon and an angel conceive a child, a Nephilim is born, a being that is half angel, half devil, and has the innate power to kill the demon king. Obviously, Mundus would take issue with this, so he decided to take matters into his own hands, personally killing Eva and imprisoning Sparta for all eternity for his betrayal. However, Sparta managed to save his two sons from meeting an early demise. He separated the boys and wiped their memories to try to protect them, though Mundus already knew of Dante's existence, and he was sure as hell not going to let him walk around scot-free. Many years go by, and the brothers end up living two very different lives. Vergil essentially becomes a trust fund kid that's also a skilled computer hacker, and Dante becomes trailer trash. Okay, the reality is a bit more complicated, but I'm just trying to set the stage here. Anyway, one night when out partying, Dante is followed home by demons sent by Mundus, and because of that carelessness, he's in for a rude awakening. Though with the help of a witch named Kat, Dante is able to fend off the demon. When the two are able to get properly acquainted with each other, Kat reveals that she's part of the organization known as the Order, a group of anonymous individuals who are hell-bent on exposing the corrupt demonic side of the city, with their leader being none other than, you guessed it,
You're my brother.
cool hat, man.
Twin brother.
While Dante is initially against joining the Order, he very soon warms up to the idea after Vergil takes them to their childhood home. This gives Dante a chance to remove those mental barriers he had, and after some introspection, he's able to break free of those shackles and fully remember who and what he is. With this newfound perspective, Dante opts to assist Vergil and Kat on their mission, not just to avenge their father, but also to learn more about himself. Like I said, the premise of this game is rather familiar. When you squint your eyes, you can see that the story of this game is supposed to be a loose combination of Devil May Cry 1 with some elements of 3. Most of that comes from Vergil, to be honest. Not much else aside from him are lifted from 3. I mean, you could make the argument that Dante's character journey and Kat's inclusion are also callbacks to that classic title, but it's very, very loose. That's the best way to surmise the narrative of this game. It's a loose retelling of some of the earliest journeys of Dante, but with so many liberties taken that it's basically its own thing. In fact, I think comparing the story of this game to any of the ones released before it is doing those games a massive disservice, because I'm just gonna be blunt here, this game's story is really rough. Devil May Cry has never really been known for having the most complex characters and themes in the world, however, that doesn't mean they aren't layered. Sure, you can watch all the cutscenes of these games and be entertained by the visuals and emotions behind the performances, but underneath that surface layer exists a story about what it means to be human. Devil May Cry not only refers to the shop that Dante runs, but it's also emblematic of what the game franchise is really about.
You assume humans are weak. Okay, yeah, their bodies lack the physical ability of a demon. But humans possess something that demons don't.
What separates humans from demons is their humanity. A consistent choice with the Devil May Cry games is that it portrays nearly every demon as these mindless killing machines. They seek chaos and bloodshed, attacking without much thought or purpose. What made Sparta so special was that he managed to escape what was expected of him, putting his own life on the line to protect something that he cared about. Demons do have the capacity to be human just as much as any regular person can become a devil. This is a constant thematic element present within nearly every Devil May Cry game. Half of the antagonists of this series are just regular people trying to discard their humanity in an attempt to chase power. They sacrifice what they value and destroy any relationships they had for selfish gain. It's almost fitting that the ones to take them down in the end tend to be those that were able to hold on to that humanity despite their inner darkness. This is an integral element of the series that's lacking in both this reboot and that Netflix show. And funnily enough, both try to use social commentary as a replacement, but at this point, you're sort of morphing the idea of what Devil May Cry is. I hold the opinion that adaptations and reboots can change aspects of the source material as long as A, it's good, and B, carries on the spirit of what that original story represented. Neither of these do that, and both suffer from it. While I did try to put aside my preferences and judge this narrative on its own terms, I still don't find it to be all that compelling. I'm not against stories trying to tackle real-world issues at all. In fact, my favorite game of 2024 did nothing but that. However, where DMC 2013 fails is that its attempts at social commentary ultimately end up being rather superficial observations. The commentary starts and ends with, all bad things in the world are because of demons. Mundus has power over the city because he controls the banks. Public surveillance is rampant. The media spreads lies and propaganda. Even the products that people consumed are laced with demonic shit to keep them at bay, not question anything around them. These are realistic problems with our world. However, DMC's solutions to these issues, that being kill the bad guy, ultimately come off as a bit childish. Like, if Mundus is gone, does that mean that all of the issues are solved? Will monsters suddenly become good for you? Because everything in Limbo City is corrupted by demons to an extent, it comes off as issues that are less ingrained in modern society and are more so just cartoonish villain schemes. I get it, this stuff is bad, but I don't need DMC to tell me that. Nor do I think it's clever social commentary to literally write the word obese on boxes of soda. The reason why I'm giving this a lot of scrutiny is because you can't ignore it. Whether you like it or not, this sort of discussion is a massive part of what this version of Devil May Cry is going for. This game treats it seriously, so I want to meet it on its own terms. But by doing so, it's easy to see just how shallow it all is. I personally don't think Devil May Cry is the right platform to talk about this sort of thing, no matter how hard people try to force it in, but that's the direction they wanted to go in. Even if I were to ignore all this stuff and just look at the plot and characters, I don't think they fare that much better. Dante's massive change in appearance was also accompanied with an equally big shift in personality. I think Ninja Theory was trying to go for a more punk or rebel type for Dante. I look at the hair, the jacket, the mannerisms, and I kinda see what they're going for. It makes sense in the context of the rest of the game. This version of Dante is meant to be someone who was abused by demons since childhood. We're shown that he's always rebelled against authority figures, so I can imagine that leaving the guy with some trust issues. It kind of fits his character to have a bit of an abrasive personality. However, what this results in is a rather unlikable protagonist. One of the things that made the original Dante stand out from the crowd was the nonchalant attitude he carried. Dante likes to have fun. He has insane demonic powers and loves every minute of it. His cutscene animations are expressive. He's got a level of confidence that's meant to be inspiring for the player. People are meant to view cutscene Dante as a goal to achieve, and with enough practice, it's certainly possible. One of my favorite parts about the old Dante was how he played around with every new weapon he got, almost like a kid opening up a new toy on Christmas morning. It gives insight into how he views his job as a demon hunter, while also giving players a sneak peek at what each weapon is capable of. That's not even counting the actual character development he goes through in these games. Dante kinda lacks all of this. He's got a big mouth on him, sure, he's not afraid to trash talk when it comes down to it, but there's a massive problem. They try to do the same character journey as in Devil May Cry 3, where he starts off sort of apathetic towards everything before discovering his humanity, but it's poorly demonstrated. He goes from not caring to suddenly being invested at the drop of a hat, and the catalyst for this growth is rather shallow. Dante's relationship with the new character Kat is supposed to play a large part in his development. There's minimum time spent trying to relate the two to each other, but beyond that, it doesn't help that I don't find Kat to be the most memorable character in the world either. I like her design, and I think it's pretty creative that she uses stencil art as a quick way to set up portals into Limbo, but Kat's certainly no lady. I don't think she's a bad character, but she's just not that interesting, I feel. Also, I think Dante's banter is pretty middling. You know, maybe there's a good line or two hidden in there, but most of the time it ranges from unnecessarily mean-spirited to just awful.
Poor mother. I don't know my mother, but if you're calling me a son of a bitch, you wouldn't be the first.
Cringe.
I won't say that this version of Dante is an outright horrible character. Like I said, there was at least an attempt at giving him some level of depth, but it's just the execution that leaves a lot to be desired. This applies to Vergil too. These two are completely different characters, though I think this is just a symptom of Dante being so different from his classic counterpart. These two brothers were always meant to contrast each other in terms of personality, and DMC does actually still keep this. If Dante was emotionally driven, then Vergil relies more on critical thinking. He's a schemer and serves as the brains behind most of the operation. Something that I do find to be pretty cool is that this game puts a unique spin on the relationship between Dante and Vergil. In the old games, we only got to see the relationship after they had their falling out when they were younger, but this game decided to take a new approach and try to establish a more healthy relationship between the brothers. I actually don't mind this at all, and it does work pretty well for most of the game, though they end up fumbling the drama when it comes down to it, unfortunately. A side of Vergil's character that goes painfully underdeveloped in this game are his true ambitions and goals. We spend 19 out of the 20 missions being all buddy-buddy with Vergil, only for him to suddenly drop this bomb at the end of the game.
Yes. Free from the demons. The path is clear for us to rule.
Say that again?
This comes right out of nowhere and has very little build-up aside from like one throwaway line. It's as if Dante and Vergil are contractually binded to have a fight whenever they're in the same story, because this just doesn't work well at all. We spend the whole game trying to build up a legitimate camaraderie between these two, so the sudden shift at the end is very abrupt and is completely unearned. It also makes me question Dante and Kat's involvement with all this, because did neither of them seriously ask Vergil what he was planning on doing after they killed Mundus? What gets me the most is that Vergil is surprised Dante doesn't want to rule over mankind. It's as if Vergil assumed he'd be okay with that. Like, this is just so forced, man. I get that Ninja Theory wanted to do the classic friends to enemies type beat, but there's just not enough room in this story to handle it with care, so it comes off as incredibly clunky. The story of this game isn't anything special. A lot of the most memorable parts are just how insane things get during the second half, and I don't mean this in a good way. Since they gave Vergil doppelganger style, do you think he also has gunslinger? Like, it's not the worst story I've ever experienced, but for a reboot that was clearly trying to put more emphasis on the narrative, it ironically ends up being less compelling than something like Devil May Cry 3, a story that was much simpler in comparison, but was told extremely competently. There was a clear focus, the themes were obvious and well executed, and above all else, it was actually entertaining. DMC Devil May Cry doesn't stick that landing. There's some good moments here and there, but the vast majority is either grating or just boring. And that's not even considering just how off-putting the characterization is. Like I said earlier, I don't mind when reboots try to do their own thing as long as they carry on the source material's spirit. Generally, I find that to be at least the bare minimum. A reboot would just be a second attempt at telling those old stories again, but actually expanding and refining those previous themes instead of trying to outright replace them. Maybe Ninja Theory was trying to use this game to establish the characters before making them more like the versions that we recognize. But because it never got a sequel, well, this is all that we're left with. Yeah, the story of this game isn't very good, and it's certainly the worst part about this reboot. If I were to judge DMC Devil May Cry only on those merits, then I'd say it's good for a laugh and not much else. Thankfully, there's more to this game than the story, and if we are going to talk about the stuff outside of that, then I actually do have a lot of nice things to say. Let's start by asking the most obvious question. Is the combat good? Yeah, it's pretty fun. DMC Devil May Cry takes a rather unique approach to its gameplay when compared to the rest of the series. At a glance, it looks familiar enough. The same core goals that the mainline series uphold are here and accounted for. A fast-paced action game with a large emphasis on stylish combat. There's a ranking system, multiple weapons to try out, and a 20-mission structure. Through and through, this is a Devil May Cry game. Not necessarily because of the story or aesthetics, but because they uphold the same core values. However, the devil, or Nephilim in this case, is in the details. The last game before this was Devil May Cry 4, and if you know anything about that game, then you know that Dante was literally the most complicated thing in the world. Shit, even now he's probably the most polished and refined action game character you can find. Keep in mind I said character and not stages. DMC4 Dante can do basically anything you want provided you have the skill and technical know-how to pull it off. The skill ceiling for Dante was near limitless, and it was impressive to play at the time and even now. Part of the reason why the 2013 game got so much ire when it was initially released was because it decided to not follow on the foundation that was laid prior. That extremely complex version of Dante would forever be shackled to a game with not enough content to support him. I mean, not forever, but it certainly felt like it. So to get a game that decided to not build off those ideas and instead go for something completely new rubbed people the wrong way. It was one of the major elements that made DMC Devil May Cry very easy to dislike when it first came out. Not because of what it was, but because of what it wasn't. Now that we live in a post-Devil May Cry 5 world, it's actually a lot easier to look back at this game and appreciate the unique ideas it brings to the table. Though, by revisiting this game, you're also putting yourself at risk of remembering its innate flaws, but we'll get to those later. As for the basics, Dante has a lot of what you would expect. He's rockin' Rebellion with his dual pistols, ebony and ivory as his default loadout, but as per tradition, Dante will eventually accumulate a vast arsenal of weapons. Only this time, there's a twist. On top of having his default weapon, Dante can now switch between Angel-class weapons and Demon-class weapons by holding down the corresponding trigger. Demon weapons are your big damage dealers. They're slower than the rest, but make up for it in raw power. The Angel weapons tend to be faster and cover a wider area of effect, but with the downside of them being on the weaker side. I'm not sure if this is a hot take or not, but this is actually a really solid lineup of weapons. Despite nearly all of them sharing the same input commands, they all come with widely different functions and can be used in pretty creative ways. There's your classic charged punchy gloves Eric's, the slick as hell Scythe or Cyrus, the crowd control beast Aquila, and finally the big fuck off axe Arbiter. This weapon in particular has always been one of my favorites in the entire franchise, mostly because of Trinity Smash. If you know, you know. Where things start to get a bit iffy are in the gun selection. We have ebony and ivory alongside this shotgun here, and then there's this sticky bomb gun called the Kablooey. With this, you can tag enemies with a bunch of bombs that you can detonate whenever you want. Guns in this game aren't very good, or even all that fun to use. DMC3 introduced the gunslinger style, which gave firearms much more utility than they otherwise would have. Giving guns alternate fire options works well with spicing up the game, and lets players create interesting, gun-focused playstyles. Guns in this reboot lack a lot of these more niche attacks, and inherently don't have the same punch as the classic counterparts. In a way, they sort of feel unfinished when compared to the standard weapons, because what special attacks are there are either underwhelming or don't do a lot of damage. Look at Rainstorm here. What was once one of my favorite moves has been turned into this slow piece of work. Still useful, but man, does it look so much lamer. Also, did anyone else notice that this game doesn't have a taunt button? Yeah, that mechanic that has been in basically every game to not only show off Dante's personality, but to give the player a risk to play around with is just not here. Like, come on, that would have fit this Dante perfectly, man. You mean to tell me that this smug son of a gun wouldn't have unique taunts of his own? Every game is better with a taunt feature, so if you're making a game that doesn't have one yet, put it in. Players will love it, trust me. Much like DMC4, you have access to everything your kit at the same time. However, instead of using the D-pad to switch styles, it's reserved for weapons and firearm switching instead. Kinda sucks that Dante doesn't have styles in this game. While you could argue that the Angel and Demon modes are meant to replace that, it doesn't scratch the same itch if you were to ask me. In case you were wondering what the circle button is used for now, that's your alternate attack command. Yeah, for some reason this game also got rid of the lock-on feature. Maybe Ninja Theory thought it was too much to ask the average player to hold down 2 shoulder buttons while still using the face buttons, and I can sort of see why. As someone who's played a lot of Nero in these games, I'm used to it, but the more casual crowd might not be used to moving their fingers in that way. Thankfully, this was added in the definitive release of the game, but it's still dumb that it wasn't at least an option here, especially when you realize that there are 2 dodge buttons for some fucking reason. But I digress. With all this stuff at Dante's disposal, there's a decent amount of combo game on offer here. A mechanic that's unique to this game that I love is the mid-combo weapon switching. In previous games, when you swapped your weapon, the combo string would also do a reset. You either had to commit to the full string you were doing, or drop it completely. This is a complaint with those old games because it works well in that context, but I really like the approach the Reboot went with. In this game, you can start a combo with one weapon, then on the pause input, switch to a different weapon entirely and finish off with a heavy attack. You know how I said Trinity Smash was one of my favorite attacks? If you're playing this game normally, you have to do 2 slow, heavy swings before you can throw out the finisher. However, with this quick swap mechanic, you can start the combo on a faster weapon like Rebellion before swapping to Arbiter to do the final hit. This works with every single weapon in the game, and if you have fast enough fingers, you can even do it with weapons of the same archetype. This feature is awesome, and it gives this Dante a unique flair that his classic counterpart doesn't have. Sure, the old Dante also has all of this, but hey, baby steps. With this mechanic in mind, DMC Devil May Cry does offer a rather flexible combo system. It's not too hard to freestyle something that looks at least somewhat decent, and with enough practice you can provide constant pressure while looking sick as hell. Though when it comes to Dante's core moveset, it's not all perfect. I already mentioned guns being relatively lame in this game, but there were some other decisions made that might not seem like much on paper, but actually end up having a rather substantial impact on the game's design. I think one of the core motivations behind changing Dante to such a degree was to help ease new players into the franchise. As much as I love Devil May Cry 4 Dante, and still do, he's about as accessible as an old Atlas game. There's nearly limitless depth on offer, however, you only get about as much as you put in, and the time investment needed to truly master Dante in DMC4 is a lot. And unfortunately, that also means his skill floor is sky high, even compared to Nero in the same game. People like Dante, and people like playing as Dante, but he's just so overwhelming. I remember when I first got to his half of the game and being absolutely floored with just how much stuff you have to play with, and it only expands as you go along. Choice paralysis at its finest. It's only after hours and hours of play that things really start to click, and when that happens, the world becomes your oyster. DMC goes for a lower skill floor so that players can experience immediate gratification. Jump canceling is a good example of this. It's by far the easiest to do in this game thanks in part to the larger hitbox, and being able to do the input at any time. There's still depth and challenge to be had though, since you need to have proper timing to get the most amount of damage out of your attacks, because if you spam it too quickly, you'll actually whiff. If you struggle with jump canceling in the mainline games, then this is actually a good way to at least get the fundamental muscle movements down. I'd consider this to be a good example of lowering the skill floor, since the ceiling is unaffected by it. However, a bad example would be with the grappling hook. I think it's funny that Nero from DMC4 was designed to be this beginner-friendly character, only for Ninja Theory to basically turn their Dante into that. I mean, look at Rebellion's attack animations and move list, and they're remarkably similar. Though I think the most obvious shared idea would be the tether move that both characters have. In DMC 2013, you have an angel tether and a demon tether. The former brings you towards enemies, and the latter brings enemies towards the player, and just like Nero in his game, this is an extremely useful feature. You can quickly reposition yourself in the enemy if your current position is unsafe, or you can use it to keep up constant pressure. Something that I missed from the mainline games was that the enemy weight actually played a part in how the player could interact with them. If an enemy was too heavy for Nero to pull towards him, he actually pulled himself instead. It makes it feel more dynamic as a result. DMC lets you choose what effect you want when you want it, and I can't help but feel as though that there's a little too much freedom, and it removes some of the identity from the enemies. Now, instead of combo routes and positioning being dictated by the enemy you're fighting, it's now down to the player to pick and choose what they want. Freedom is nice in an action game, however, too much freedom and the systems in question start to lose their impact. These hooks make it a little too easy to isolate demons from encounters and stall in the air. Regardless of enemy weight, you're now able to get whatever outcome you want. That's an example of a skill floor that directly impacts the skill ceiling. By making specific choices easier to access, you're inadvertently affecting the maximum skill potential that can be tapped into. I think a big issue that this game runs into is its enemy selection. Like, yeah, there's a decent number of enemies on offer here, and some even have interesting gimmicks, but the problem is that they're not as aggressive as they should be. Something that a lot of people tend to forget about Devil May Cry is that the foundation of the series was built on a higher than average difficulty. Hideki Kamiya was a big fan of arcade games, and he used their brutal difficulty as a basis for DMC. This is because getting through a tough-as-nails game while making it look easy makes the player look cool. The way this was accomplished in the classic games was by making the enemies hyper-aggressive. In a good action games, the enemies and players are in a constant dance for control over the fight. Get too overwhelmed and you'll quickly find yourself getting beaten down. This is the philosophy that has been carried over into DMC 3 and 4, and yeah, it certainly makes the game feel more exciting. As cool as those combo clips you see on Twitter are, I can't help but feel as though they do a poor job at selling these games to newcomers. I mean, sure, it looks cool and is technically impressive. However, action games aren't just about what you can do to the enemy. What separates an alright game from a great one is what the enemies also have at their disposal. Final Fantasy XVI is a game that suffers from this heavily. That game has a rather impressive combo system, but because nearly every enemy in the game is a punching bag that can't fight back, it ends up making the combat rather boring once the cool animations wear off. I may or may not be making a video on this game, so I'll save that discussion for later. DMC Devil May Cry sort of suffers from this too, but it's thankfully not as bad. However, there are a lot of enemies that do fall into the fodder category. It's not even in the case of 3 or 4 where you have to stagger the enemy before they become susceptible to air combos. If an enemy can be launched into the air, then you're free to go to town for as long as you want. As much as I find certain enemies from 3 and 4 to be annoying, I can at the very least say that they were memorable. A bad enemy in the DMC reboot is forgettable because it doesn't have a lot of depth to it. Maybe there are a handful of attacks, but those become negligible the moment their feet leave the floor. Some of the better enemies in this game are the ones that have built-in counters to infinite juggling, or at least take more skill to keep them elevated. These fat dudes are probably my favorite demons in the game, because not only is it tricky to launch them, but keeping them suspended is a skill in its own right. Flub the juggle and send them to the ground, and they'll enter this rage state and become hyper-aggressive. That's a dynamic enemy right there, and I wish there were more that behaved like this. But if we're talking about memorable DMC enemies, then ooh boy do I got the demons for you! You know what the best part about Devil May Cry is? How you're able to tackle any scenario with any weapon of your choosing. It's fun, what can I say? Sure, some weapons are going to be undoubtedly more effective than others depending on the scenario, but you can at the very least use everything and deal damage. That's the bare minimum here. So, what the hell are these? For some reason or another, DMC Devil May Cry decided to introduce color-coded enemies into the mix. Red enemies only take damage from demon weapons, and blue enemies only take damage from angel weapons. That's pretty bad, not gonna lie. I think it's pretty obvious as to why this isn't a great idea for Devil May Cry. All this really does is restrict your weapon selection from 5 weapons to 2, and for most of the game, it's actually only 1 if you're fighting the blue enemies. These enemies are just boring, man. Only 2 demons in the game have color-coded variations, so you'll quickly grow tired of seeing them. I mean, I say only 2 as if it's a bad thing, but imagine if every enemy had something like this. Oh man, I would have lost it. It's not so bad when you're fighting the red guys because at least demon weapons deal a lot of damage. It just becomes so tiring when you're using an angel weapon, dude. The Ghost Rage is probably the worst enemy in the game because of it. Angel weapons are already on the weaker side, so forcing players to do extended combos with these gets old real fast. This is where Devil Trigger comes in to alleviate some of the issues. DT in 2013 functions very differently than the other games, and I can't quite say I'm a fan of the change. Not only is the design super lame, but mechanically, it's totally uninteresting. This is because, unlike the old games, Devil Trigger prevents enemies from attacking you. Yeah, as soon as you activate it, every enemy is thrown into the air and won't come back down until it's over. Since this game already has an issue with most demons being helpless against you, this is something that I only saved for boss battles. Not like you'll be using this much regardless because of just how long it takes to fill up. Man, if only there was a mechanic that would make it charge faster. Wow, wouldn't that be cool? I often find myself saving Devil Trigger for when I'm fighting the color-coded demons because while DT is active, they take damage from every weapon. So fuck it, Devil Trigger in this game will now forever be the blue removal. Wanna try something fun? When fighting a boss, if you activate Demon Evade and enter Devil Trigger, you can just delete their health. I do it against the Hunter all the time. Not because I don't like fighting it the normal way, it might actually be my favorite boss here if I'm being honest, but after he gives you so much shit for the whole stage, it feels good to just put him in his place in a single blow. While I'm at it, I may as well go over the boss fights. They're alright. Probably some of the weaker ones in the series mechanically though. A lot are these stationary monsters with Zelda-like approaches to their encounters. I do enjoy the cinematic flair they have though, especially when it's bonus damage that triggers because the player was able to parry something. Again, it's why I like the first boss a lot. It has quite a few of those. You'd think that Vergil would be the best fight in the game, but not really. Like, it's fine, but it comes off more so as a poor imitation of his Devil May Cry 3 fight than anything. Also, this part at the end here is a bit confusing because you need to go into Devil Trigger to land the final blow, and the game doesn't do a great job at conveying this. The music is sick though, and I actually do like the mid-battle phase transitions here. The presentation of this game is one of its major strong suits. This is actually the game that introduced the idea of the music being affected by the style ranking, if you can believe it. I'm also a big fan of the use of slow motion at the end of combat rounds, and those little inserts of Dante taking notice of the upcoming wave. Oh, but Limbo is a great setting for the gameplay. I like how it twists and morphs as you journey through the different stages. It keeps first-time players on their toes because at any moment, the world itself will suddenly become your greatest enemy. As scripted and as simple as the platforming is in this reboot, it at the very least makes the level design more fun to travel through. Kind of wish the sprint feature didn't have to go. That was a really nice part about DMC4. Without it, I find myself spamming the angel dash like a lunatic just to get to my destination slightly faster. Outside of the core gameplay, DMC offers about the same amount of content as the other releases do, closer to 3 than 4 if you catch my drift. You get 20 main missions alongside a bunch of secret missions for health upgrades and the like. There's a bloody palace mode as to be expected, and with each playthrough of the campaign, you unlock higher and higher difficulties until you reach the fabled Dante Must Die mode. I actually find this game to be a lot better on the higher end because the enemy formations were changed to the more unique lineup, though that does expose you to more color-coded enemies unfortunately, and the higher difficulty also means they take longer to beat. I take that back, I think I like the regular mode more. New to the reboot though is the Heaven and Hell mode. This is actually a fun gimmick mode. Here, every attack you land is a one-hit kill. However, the same rule applies to you. While if you're just trying to beat the mode, you can just spam your guns. If you want to get a good rank, then you have to interact with the enemies in more meaningful ways. Beat Heaven and Hell mode and you get the aptly titled Hell and Hell mode, where enemies are strong but Dante can't take any damage or else you'll die instantly. These are some fun time sinks and are a good way to spice up repeat playthroughs of the game. Though, if you are looking to play through this game, then you're better off with the following. As someone who tends to prefer the original releases of games when possible, even I'll admit that DMC Definitive Edition is the better option between the two. It features a lot of mechanical rebalances and some extra goodies that bring the experience closer in line with the mainline Devil May Cry games. Firstly, the color-coded enemies have been slightly tweaked to allow more player freedom. All this really means is that your attacks no longer bounce off if you're using the wrong type of weapon. If you want hit stun, you still have to use the correct weapon type, but this small change makes fighting this class of enemy a little bit more bearable. A manual lock-on was added, thank God, but I'm a bit mixed on its implementation. It's nice to see how much health an enemy has, but the game's general controls are still the same whether you use this feature or not. All it's really good for is letting the player do stingers with the classic input and not much else. It would have been cool if new attacks were added to take advantage of the lock-on feature, but I guess that was beyond the scope of this release. There sort of is one new skill, but it's just a more effective Angel Evade. Fun to play around with, but not much of a game changer. For that, you want to look towards stuff like Turbo Mode. I'm sort of baffled that this feature was excluded from the base game. It's sort of justifiable for the PlayStation 3 and 360 versions, but why the hell was this not in the PC version? You can't just give a man Turbo Mode and rip it away. It'll make him go crazy. The last thing you want is to make Devil May Cry fans mad. Give them enough time and they'll find a way to jump cancel in real life. The real selling point of Definitive Edition, at least to me, is the new Hardcore mode. This can be toggled on and off before starting a mission. It essentially rebalances the game to be more in line with the older titles. Enemies deal more damage, Devil Trigger fills up faster and no longer sends enemies flying into the air, and parry windows are more strict than before. These few changes actually do make this my preferred way of playing the game. Crank up the difficulty and turn on Turbo Mode and it's a pretty good time. Though one element that I'm not the biggest fan of is the change to the style meter. Don't get me wrong, the one from the vanilla game certainly needed to be tweaked. It was far too easy to get triple S ranks in combat for numerous reasons. While I do appreciate Definitive Edition for trying to mend this issue, I think they went a little too far into the opposite direction. I don't know about you guys, but I fucking suck at keeping the style rank up in this game. Might just be a skill issue on my end, but I find this thing to be so damn strict. And once you hit sensational rank, you basically always have to be providing constant pressure to hold onto it, or else that thing drops like a rock. Man, if only there was a mechanic whereby putting the player at risk, they can help aid their style ranking. Wouldn't that be crazy? I think what you're supposed to do is land the finishing blow on your dial combos, since it nets you more points than the opening hits. Here's the thing though, when you've been playing a game franchise in a certain way for years, that muscle memory is hard to fight. A lot of the final hits of combos send demons flying away, so I tend to avoid doing that when playing DMC. I guess that's what the hooks are for, but again, muscle memory. I'm not faulting the game for not designing itself around my playstyle, though it does feel a bit bad that sit combos can barely get me above an A rank. Shit, sometimes it's stuck at D because the developers don't like the way I juggle enemies, though that's only a minor hiccup in what is otherwise a fun option for hardcore players. That's not all, because Definitive Edition comes with all of the DLC for the base game free of charge. So rejoice in your crappy Devil May Cry 1 cosplay. I can see why they redesigned Dante now, because holy shit does the classic look clash with the gritty visuals. That stuff is fun and all, but nah, the only DLC that matters is Vergil's downfall. This campaign was released about 2 months after the base game, and it's meant to chronicle Vergil's villain arc. After the defeat at the hands of his brother, Vergil finds himself in the underworld, where he goes on an introspective journey. Essentially, his demonic side taunts him with his insecurities, conjuring up a fake cat in Dante to further stoke the flames. By confronting and killing these facsimiles, Vergil ends up severing the human side of his heart, which in turn feeds his desire to gain more power. Ninja Theory was clearly trying to set up sequel bait with this DLC, but I'm sorry, I just don't find this Vergil to be all that compelling. His thirst for power in the original games was motivated by the loss of his mother. He felt powerless, so he decided to discard his human side to try to become the strongest version of himself. Not because he's some secret mastermind trying to take over the world, but because deep down, he's scarred by that loss and never wants to go through anything like that again. This Vergil seems to only want power because he's petty and wants revenge on Dante. Maybe there's more to it than that, but I can't take this guy seriously because his Awakened design is just plain goofy. What is it with reboots and trying to have characters earn their design? This game does it twice, by the way. Dante can't just have white hair, no, it has to be something his demon powers gave him. Yeah, sure, you can teleport, attack faster than the eye can see, and continuously jump off enemies' heads, but swept back hair? Nah, that's what we have to explain. This just looks so lame, dude. I'm not going to critique the thin story here because it's clearly just a bonus. The main appeal to Vergil's downfall is being able to take control of the character himself. I'm a bit mixed on Vergil's execution here. On one hand, this version of Vergil does have some fun stuff under the hood. I like this charge mechanic, where if you have exact timing, then attack properties are altered. It's a bit of a precursor as to what Capcom would eventually go with in the mainline games with that whole perfect judgment cut mechanic. Only here it's applied to multiple attacks. I like this, it adds a layer of skill for players to master. Makes you pay more attention to your button timings, you know? Instead of Angel and Devil modes giving Vergil different weapons, he instead has different attack styles with his Yamato. There's some familiar stuff here if you played DMC 3 before this, like his summon swords, judgment cuts, and he even has Dante's doppelganger style as his devil trigger. It's funny in retrospect to see that the later versions of this character would end up taking from this guy mechanically. While Vergil in the mainline games has a reputation of being an overpowered character, the one in the 2013 game is actually a lot more balanced. In a way, I do appreciate this. As fun as living out the power fantasy is, part of me does yearn for a Vergil that has the same level of combat balance as Nero and Dante. So I'm willing to give points to DMC for managing to accomplish this goal, even if it's by virtue of having a rather bare kit. Like I said, there's some fun stuff you can pull off with Vergil with enough practice, and it is fun for the most part. However, it doesn't take too long to see everything this guy has cooking. When you break down his move list, you realize that certain skills are locked to specific weapon modes without much justification. Why is the Angel style basic attack Rapid Slash and not a unique combo like with Dante? Vergil only has one pause combo and it's on his default style. Because of this move division, you have to get used to constantly changing attack styles, even more so than with Dante, funnily enough. This is the most evident with air combos, because there isn't really a whole lot this character can do in the air other than some simple jump cancel strings into alternate attacks. Not nearly as fun as Dante if you were to ask me. They gave Vergil that sick dive move from the classic games though. With Angel Dash, it sort of reminds me of the movement tech you could do in the old games, only a little more clunky here. I get that this is DLC at the end of the day and was probably made to be a proof of concept as to what Vergil would play like in a potential sequel, but that game never came out, so all that we're left with is this lacking character. He's fun enough, but whenever I do boot up this game to play the campaign or do a run of Bloody Palace, I don't tend to find myself all too compelled to pick up Vergil. I've seen some sick gameplay with him, but he's just not for me. Man, DMC Devil May Cry is a really weird game, isn't it? You know, going into this video, I was expecting it to be a lot shorter than it ended up being. A quick 25-minute romp where we have a laugh and hey, maybe highlight some of this game's good qualities. I tend to underestimate just how much I have to say about a game until I actually start writing about it. I think this is a sign that, for as much shit as this game got when it first came out, some justified, some not so much, there's plenty of good to discuss. As I said earlier, this game was so easy to hate when it first came out. Not because of what it was, but because of what it represented at the time. The original Devil May Cry was the frontrunner in the 3D action genre. It basically created a whole type of game on its own, and there are plenty of titles, both big and small, that even to this day take inspiration from it. Each subsequent game built off of what the original title set out to accomplish, and became better and better with each passing entry. At least in terms of the core mechanics and depth. However, this reboot, at least at the time, went against that. DMC4, the infamously unfinished game that it was, still had amazing combat. The potential of how it could be expanded further fueled the imagination of diehards. So when this reboot comes along and completely changes the formula, style, attitude, characters, all the while parading itself to be better than what came before it, it left a bad taste in people's mouths, and they responded accordingly. For a reboot that was made with the purpose of attracting new fans and broadening the series' appeal, it ironically did the exact opposite. Received well by critics and newcomers that were willing to try it, but despised by fans. And whether you like it or not, negativity gets more attention. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that this game doesn't deserve any of the backlash it got. You kidding me? With a story like that, it's so deserved. But the actual game part, it's pretty good. I find myself booting this one up every once in a while because it offers a unique enough take on the core Devil May Cry mechanics to be interesting. Sure, its full potential can only really be tapped into with the definitive version, but the vanilla release of the game is more than playable. You just have to have a tolerance for some crappy design every now and then. And hey, what's Devil May Cry without a little bit of bullshit? I find it weird how many people say that this game killed the franchise when it came out. Really, it didn't. Sure, the big number 5 came out about 6 years later, but that game was already being worked on by 2015, only 2 years after this one. As much as people don't want to admit it, this game matters just as much to the Devil May Cry legacy as any other game in this series does, to the point where its influence can be felt in the latest mainline title. So sure, the game failed to accomplish its goals as a reboot, but as an action game in its own right, DMC Devil May Cry is greater than the sum of its parts.